So the talk today is about Trumponomics, and there's this boring title that has something to do with Trumponomics and the global economy. And then I thought about kind of jazzing up the title a little bit and make it about, is Trumponomics going to get him reelected in 2020? But I'll steer clear of that to some degree. So the outline of the talk is just going to be to describe a little bit what I mean by Trumponomics. I have to come up with some definition. And then I'm going to talk about what produced Trumponomics. Why is it that the American public voted for a particular approach to economics? And then I'll talk about, will it work? Will it address the factors that produced it? And what are the likely effects on the US economy and the global economy? By the way, I grew up in New York in a Jewish family where by now, if we were at the dinner table, I would have been interrupted 4, 5, 6 times. So if questions come up, there's no need to wait. I'll definitely stop and leave plenty of times for Q&A, but if questions come up beforehand, maybe you don't all talk at once, but we can kind of do a little bit organized, but feel free to sort of interrupt as we go. So what is Trumponomics? I'll come back to this when we talk about will it work or not, but just to get it on the table, there's this element, America First, which for those of you with a little bit of history background, it's a very unfortunate 2 words given how it's been used in US history before. But for now, we'll just focus on the economics, which is that the goal is to discourage imports of both goods and services on the one hand, and people as well, and to negotiate bilateral trade deals, better bilateral trade deals. So there's rarely a goal in Trumponomics to tear down trade in general, but more to negotiate a better deal with Mexico, with China, with Canada. So we'll come back to that. The other is the fiscal stimulus, which was great advertisement. I think he purposely did that for my talk. It had nothing to do with that his 100th day is today. He kind of decided to talk about the fiscal stimulus, so it would be point 2 would be well advertised. And the last has to do with deregulation of finance. And I'll talk about this. I participated in an event at the US Treasury this week to talk about deregulation. And for those of you who took my class, you know that that's dear to my heart and also something that causes me a lot of trepidation where things are going. So what produced Trumponomics? I think 2 core things. They're interrelated. One has to do with stagnant wages, and the other has to do with growing inequality. In the US, they have gone hand in hand, although they don't have to go hand in hand. You can have stagnant middle-class wages and without having growing inequality, and you can have growing inequality without having stagnant middle-class wages, but the US has achieved both. So I thought I'd start out with this graph, and again, I apologize to Sarah, Billy, some of the others who took the class this year, but this is a graph that I think reveals a lot, and this graph didn't just start a few years ago. Many of us have been watching this graph evolve over time, wondering when something was going to happen. So the 2 things I want you to focus on are the top line, which is real output per person, and it grows very, very steadily for a long period of time. There's some wiggles, global recession, a few other things, but it pretty much grows steadily. And then the other line I want you to look at is the flat one, that's red. That's the real wages of the typical person. The median income. So half of the people earn more than that, half of the people earn less than that. So that's the typical person. And you can see that real median wages in the US have been flat since the 1970s. Okay? So, people have been aware of this for at least the last decade or so. And there's something that kind of, in a democracy, can't hold like that. It's very difficult to have real wages of the typical person not growing at all, while the average goes up, meaning that the top must be growing a lot. And I'll show you that graph in just a moment. Okay. And then this has to relate to it relates more directly to growing inequality, where you can look at what's been going on with the top 1% and what's been going on with the bottom 50%. And so this is the pre-tax share of national income. And again, this suggests this growing inequality in the US, where the top are getting a larger and larger share of the pie, and the bottom are getting a smaller and smaller share of the overall economic pie. And so this can give rise, and did give rise, to a reaction that something must change. And that's one of the big things. Now, I wanted to put this in a global context because I think this is very revealing. Now, this graph is a little bit difficult to explain, but not that difficult to explain. So this, you can think of this as let's take everybody in the world, and we can look at how much every person in the world is earning, and we can rank those people from the poorest to the richest, and then that gives us a percentile. And then we can look at how fast did the typical person at that percentile, how fast did his or her income grow from 1988 until 2008. So for example, if you take the person at the 40th percentile, and you take the person at the 40th percentile of everybody in the world in 1988 and say, what's that person's income? And then you would go to 2008 and you would find the person at the 40th percentile. It's going to be a different person, of course, but you find the person at the 40th percentile and you look at what's the growth rate between those two incomes. And that's what's graphed on the vertical axis. Okay, so you can see if you're about the median person in the world, the median person in the world's income was growing very, very rapidly, over 70%, and that also happens to correspond to about where the middle class in China is. If you look at the middle class in the US, and this is also the middle class in Germany and in Japan and in other well-to-do countries in the world, you can see that the median person, the average person in that country, essentially had zero real income growth, which is consistent with the graph we just looked at. And then you can see for hopefully I would guess most of us, this has been a period of pretty rapid growth, where the growth rate of the people in the top 1% of the world's income, which is definitely most of the people in this area of the world, their incomes have been growing about the same as the growth rate of the fastest other group in the world, which is sort of the Chinese middle class. Okay? Okay. So, these observations and the feelings I think that they created among the US population help produce an assessment of what's going wrong, of what went wrong. Now we can talk about whether they're right or wrong, and that's what we're going to do now, but it certainly created a view that things are not going in the proper direction. I chose 3 contributing factors. I chose these 3 because I think they underlie the view that came forth with Trump and also with Bernie Sanders and others. One has to do with globalization. The other has to do with technological change, and the other has to do, and I'm going to add this in because I think it's at the essence and it's too much forgotten, insufficient growth in human capital skills. And I'll come back to that once I go into the others a little bit. Okay, so first on globalization. So I think the one thing to recognize on globalization is that the period that we've experienced looks in many ways like the experiences in the US and other countries with opening up with trade for a very, very long period of time. Now talk about what's a little bit different now, but most of the things are fairly similar. And what are those things? There's an enormous amount of evidence. Or as we joked around, and if we want to be more Trump-like, there's a huge amount of evidence that trade expands the economic pie. Okay? And the evidence on this is just overwhelming. You could go and you could look at trade routes in ancient times, when they would open up and various areas would be exposed to trade, those are the areas where you'd see the fastest growth. When transportation networks were expanded in the US, for example, through navigable waterways, it was those areas that experienced the biggest increase in economic growth and prosperity. When countries close off to trade, Argentina, for example, you can have a century almost of stagnation. So the links between trade and the expanding of the economic pie, this part is pretty clear. What's also pretty clear, and this has been known since Ricardo, for a very long period of time, is just because the pie grows doesn't mean that everybody's slice is going to grow. Okay? Now, it does mean that because the pie grows, everybody's slice can grow. But it doesn't mean that everybody's slice does grow. There can be winners and losers from trade. The other thing is this last one, is that it oftentimes takes time for people to adjust. So the classic example here is Portugal and England, and they open up to trade, and England, before they open up to trade, is producing wheat and wine, and the wine's not too good. And Portugal is producing wheat and wine, and the wine is good. And the wheat, I guess, is not so great. And then they open up to trade, and you get more and better wheat, and you get more and better wine. There can, however, be some changes in the slices of the pie in each place. For example, you can get, in England, the wine producers and the workers in the wine industry are going to be hurt as the wheat industry expands and England imports wine. The issue here, though, at the last point, is that eventually what we've seen throughout history when opening up to trade is that people make their way in England from the wine industry and into the wheat industry and other industries. And so in that way, people can prosper from this opening up to trade where countries can do what they're best at. And this has been the experience for many, many countries over a very long time period. Okay, now this time with trade is a bit different. And the reason why it's different is because it involves China. And China is gigantic. And so when China enters into the world market, this was a change in globalization and trade that really hadn't been experienced before. And it really has nothing to do with some strange trade pact or exchange rate manipulations. We can talk about that. It has to do with the fact that 1 billion people who were primarily doing labor-intensive, low-skilled work entered the world economy. And that had profound implications. The other thing that's different this time is that trade, the effects of trade on the middle class were magnified by technological changes that started before China really became a part of the global market and continued throughout that time. And I'm going to emphasize, and I think that the econometric, the economic research that has been done so far is going to focus a lot on technological changes, not just trade. Okay? Okay, technological change. So, people are expensive. And when it's possible to develop software and hardware and robots and mechanisms that substitute for fairly routine analytical jobs and routine manual type jobs, inventions take place in order to do so because that's part of what firms do in order to maximize profits. That may be intensified by trade, but it'll go on without trade as well. Okay. That has tended over the last century, and especially since the 70s, has focused on programming away routine analytical jobs and routine manual jobs. Now, it's also done something that's good for us. It's that it's increased the premium for people who can do non-routine, complex problem solving. This has been very good for me. And it's also increased the demand for people who can mobilize and motivate and communicate and manage people and get people moving in directions quickly as technology changes and people have to be redirected. The returns, the payments that economies are willing to give to people with those interpersonal management skills has also increased. Okay, so the technology has not simply reduced the demand for some workers. It's also increased the demand for other types of skills. Okay, and this is a graph that I want to show you to illustrate this. Now, what the US does is that every year they look at every occupation, and for every occupation they do a pretty in-depth documentation of what types of skills are demanded. What do you have to do in order to do that job? What does that job demand? And this started with the Great Depression because it was a goal to document what types of jobs are needed so that people could be moved across the country to fill certain jobs. And then, of course, with bureaucracy, sometimes the Depression went away, but the bureaucracy for collecting this information stayed, which is good for people doing research on what types of skills are demanded. So the point that I want to show here is that you can see that the demand for many types of routine analytical and even non-routine physical type jobs have decreased. And the only two categories of skills that increase are the ones that I mentioned: non-routine analytical problem solving and the ability to work with people and manage people. Okay? I also want you to see that these changes start in the early 70s. Okay? And they've been intensifying ever since, but they start a long time ago. So a routine cognitive skill would be a routine cognitive skill might be say making the travel appointments for speakers that come to your work. It might be some simple types of accounting, Excel spreadsheet type work that didn't involve complex problem solving. And that has changed over time. That what once was non-routine analytical, due to technological advancements, have been made routine. And that process is continuing. Okay. So, this is a little bit messy, I know, but I specialize in non-routine. Either that or since this is not mine, you could say I specialize in plagiarizing other people's non-routine stuff. So this is exposure to robots over this particular period, 1993 to 2007. And then on the vertical axis, you see the changes in wages. Now, this is done at the commuter zone. So you look at, in some sense, metropolitan areas, okay, areas of focused economic activity in the US. And then you ask, you can measure the exposure to robots in several ways. One is you can see what's the increase in robots in that area. And then for those of you who took statistics, you may worry. Maybe there's some sort of causality problem there. So the other thing you can do is you can say what types of occupations are demanded in this particular commuter zone. And then you could go to, say, Europe, and it's a different country, and you could say, have those occupations been automated away? Or to what degree have those occupations been automated away in Europe? Then you could take that measure from Europe and bring it back and attach it to that particular commuter zone in the US. So the goal is, given the economic activity that was taking place in a particular area, to what degree have robots started to operate in that area? And what you can see is that's negatively associated with wages. So this is getting at this point of how important technology has been. Now, I want to point something out here, that this analysis of this negative relationship controls for many things. Okay, so it controls for aspects about the individual, age and gender and experience, things like that. It also controls for whether this commuter zone, whether the things produced in that commuter zone experienced greater exposure to international trade. For example, let's say you go to a commuter zone that makes textiles. Okay? Some elements of textiles, there may be automation, and that would get part of the measure there would be the degree to which there are robots. Another thing in that commuter zone is because it's textiles, perhaps it's more exposed to international trade. And we can measure that too, or they measured that as well. So this relationship holds even after controlling for exposure to trade. Technology matters even when you control for trade. Now, I thought that you'd be sort of curious. Is it technology? Is it openness to trade? So this is a little bit messy, but what it is on your left, you have exposure to robots, and on your right, there's exposure to trade from China. You could do this also for Mexico, in other trade in general, it doesn't matter. So the darker colors mean you're more exposed to robots, and the darker colors mean you're more exposed to trade from China. Now, there's similarities of exposure. So if you just look at the graph quickly, you'll say, oh, look at that. There were certain places like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin that seemed to have a lot of red. And maybe that was associated, maybe trade and technology all work together. Now, if you start to look at the graph long enough, and I don't recommend that, but if you start to look at the graph long enough, what you'll see is that they're actually different where there's exposure. So if you look at the exposure to robots, it's very, very intense toward the Great Lakes, and that's not as much so with the exposure to trade. There's some overlap, but not as much as you would think just from viewing it quickly. So the way they define exposure to robots here is they go to a commuting zone. In this graph, it's they go to a commuting zone and they see what type of stuff is produced in that commuting zone. And then what they do is they go to Europe and they see where is similar type stuff produced, what has changed in terms of the number of robots that's used to produce that stuff in Europe, and then they take that number, exposure to robots for producing that stuff, and they apply it to that commuter zone. They do that so that it's not just whether this particular commuter zone increased its demand for robots, it's whether there was something technological about what was being produced there that would make it more likely to be exposed to robots. Now, actually, the graph to me not strange, because you may say, well, wouldn't there be more robots in the Bay Area? No, I would say no, because what the Bay Area does is the non-routine analytical stuff. It invents the instructions for creating robots. And then it ships those instructions somewhere else where they're built by robots. So, yeah. Okay. Actually, when you do this at the very small level, the correlation is only about 5%. The exposure is not immense in terms of where these things take place. Oh, one more thing. So if you do the analysis and you say, okay, what matters then? Is it trade or is it technology? So you say, okay, I'm going to explain wages with robots, and I'm going to explain wages with trade. If I forget about robots and I just examine trade, trade explains wages. If I forget about trade and I just look at robots, robots explain wages. If I put them both in and I say, now what? Robots explain wages and trade doesn't matter. Okay. So some of the takeaways, at least for a nice little talk on a beautiful day. So globalization and technology, they increase the demand for people with particular types of skills, and they decrease the demand for people with other types of skills. And the people whose skills lost out are essentially people who do fairly low-skilled, labor-intensive type jobs. And people's skills have not adjusted rapidly enough. Okay, one thing that can adjust is that if there's an increased demand for people with these types of skills, is an economy can train those people to do those types of skills. Obviously, given what we see in terms of stagnant middle-class wages and growing income inequality, is that although there's been a change in the demand for skills, there hasn't been much of a change in the supply of those skills. What do you expect from an economist, right? It's all going to come back to supply and demand somehow. Okay. Now this one I don't want to push too hard, but just a little bit. Okay? That trade almost certainly contributed to growing inequality. But most of this really has to do with technology. Why do I say that? It's because it's not that China joining the WTO caused a huge drop in US import tariffs on things produced in China. It just wasn't that big of a deal. NAFTA did get rid of a lot of impediments, but those impediments were just not that big. The other thing is that all of these trends start before China joined the WTO and before NAFTA. So it's hard to pin this down to trade as opposed to changes in technology. What I'm saying is that, I'm saying is that technology shifted the demand away from low-skilled workers toward high-skilled workers, and that reduced wages.
What about manufacturing jobs?
So I think that, so then the question is, if there hadn't been the change in trade, would those manufacturing jobs have gone overseas? And I think the answer is yes, they would have gone overseas. Why? They would have gone overseas because, so there's two parts here. So was there a change in trade policy such that it's the change in trade policy that shifted those jobs overseas? And I think that it's very difficult to make that argument because the trade barriers that were reduced were very small. One could make the argument that if the US completely closed off from trade, would those jobs have shifted overseas? Not as early as they did, but what would have happened was technology was nonetheless operating to eliminate the demand for a lot of the jobs in manufacturing. For example, this is well known now that when they talk about, when people talk about bringing back iron extraction jobs, those are now very high-tech jobs that are not labor-intensive anymore. And I think the solar power industry, producing solar panels, is now more labor-intensive. So, yeah. Okay, Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Maybe that's not, yeah, I guess it is on. Could I ask you a question about the trade deals themselves, within them? And what I mean by that is, I think that a Trump supporter would say something along the lines of, regardless of the contribution of robots versus trade, to the extent that trade has some involvement at all,
Yep.
that the trade deals, and it doesn't matter if it's China, NAFTA, with Europe, anywhere, were negotiated on terms where they favored, and this was favored by both the establishments of the Democratic Party and the establishments of the Republican Party. They tended to favor Wall Street and financial elites and media elites in broadcasting journalism, Hollywood, and so on, at the expense of the states that Trump unexpectedly won, where manufacturing and agriculture were more important. Can you comment on the nature of the trade deals and whether that argument has any merit, and if so, how much?
So I guess, I'm a little, I don't think that, so let me start from, I don't think that the US negotiated trade deals in anything other than a strategy of America first. The US was never negotiating trade deals designed for the detriment of the US and for the benefit of other countries. Now, were there problems with those trade deals? This is a complicated negotiation, so there are going to be pluses and minuses. What did the US want out of some of those trade deals? So even if you look at TPP. So yes, one of the things that the US pushed for was it wanted to get access to the things that the US was particularly good at. One of them is financial services. So part of all these trade deals was that the US wanted other countries to reduce their barriers to financial service providers. Other countries wanted the US to reduce barriers to the importation of goods and services that were primarily manufacturing type jobs. That, however, reflects what the US has a particular advantage in that it does a pretty good job of doing non-routine analytical things, and it does a fairly bad job, given wages, of producing high labor-intensive, low-skilled goods. The other thing is that you would have to frame this in terms this is something negotiated with the WTO. So this is not a bilateral deal between the US and China. This was part of a multilateral arrangement. Even if the US right now were to negotiate, as Trump would say, a better deal with China, I'm not sure what better deal means, but whatever it means. So let's say it means that more goods are more expensive now to import from China. This presupposes that that the next lowest cost producer of whatever the US is buying from China is the US. So if it costs more to buy stuff from China, does this mean that production is going to shift to the US to provide jobs to low-skilled workers? Very unlikely when there's Vietnam next door, when there's India, another big country with a lot of unskilled workers. So negotiating different bilateral trade deals unlikely to be successful. Let's say it becomes more expensive to import timber from Canada. Is the next lowest cost producer going to be the northwest of the US, or is it going to be Indonesia? Now, if the US is talking about, if the goal is to really close off to trade in general, then the US would become much, much poorer. Whereas I think what the goal is to do is to negotiate a little bit better deal here and there. And he might be successful at that, and that might save an establishment or two. But on a big scale, is that going to reverse course in terms of middle-class wages and inequality? I think very unlikely. Right? So the question is it feasible for the US to reduce its trade deficit while simultaneously increasing its fiscal deficits in order to cut taxes and spend more on infrastructure. So I focused, so this is one reason I chose the goals carefully. So I think that, and also I think from a political perspective, I think that if Trump is running for president in 2020, and his policies have managed to reduce inequality and increase the earnings of the middle class, that nobody's going to care about trade deficits. Whereas if I think that he reduced trade deficits and income inequality continued to expand and the plight of the middle class continued to decline, he's going to have a tough time. So, and I actually think that that's exactly right. I think the focus shouldn't be on the trade deficit. Now, the answer to your question, just to give it, is that if the tax changes and the infrastructure spending caused such a large increase in output, if output goes up enough, and you produce all of that output and people in the US don't buy it, and you export it, then you could generate that scenario. I'm not pushing that argument, I couldn't resist answering the question. So, if this isn't, let's start with the bottom, because we just did that. This bilateral trade deal thing, it looks good. It's like, oh, they're doing something we don't like, and therefore we'll negotiate a better deal with them. I'm now using the pronoun we because we're talking about the US and I'm from here. But I guess I should use I. Anyway, okay, forget the pronoun thing. The bilateral trade deal is, the problem is it's a multilateral world. The example that I gave about if the US increases import tariffs so it's more expensive to buy stuff from China, it doesn't mean that that production is going to shift to the US. Very unlikely that it's going to shift to the US. It's not like, oh, the US all of a sudden became good, competitive in low-wage jobs. Okay, there are lots of other low-wage places around. The other thing is that technology has continued to advance. It's not stopping, okay? So to me, the underlying causes are not some gigantic change in liberalized trade. You can't look at the history of US barriers to trade and say, aha, this is when the US all of a sudden got rid of trade restrictions on trading with China and Mexico and other countries. There was a small reduction, but not a very large reduction. The big changes are technology that's taken place, and this has been going on for a few decades. And I see no reason that that technology is going to stop innovating away routine type jobs. Now, people can disagree with that, but that's I look at the research that's been done on this, I find it hard to not come away with this conclusion. Tax cuts, okay. Tax cuts might spur the economy. This is going to be tempered by a couple of things. If anything like the current tax cuts go through, and I think that that's unlikely, deficits would rise quite a bit, and many people might become nervous about future taxes, then this would impact all sorts of investment decisions. That yes, the returns to investment in the near term after tax would be low, but if tax rates are going to rise a lot in the future, and you do your net present value calculations, that's also going to be incorporated into one's assessments. Very unlikely, this comes to the question, very unlikely that these tax cuts are going to have long and enduring effects on growth, especially these tax cuts. So for those of you who took my class, you know I love this graph. So what this graph is this is real per capita GDP in the US from 1850 to the present. It's on a logarithmic scale so that the slope is the growth rate. Okay? And so what you can see is the growth rate It's fairly constant. There's this little thing, the Great Depression. But besides that, it's about 1.8% per year. Now, how it works. This is my point about the global financial crisis. In 20 years, we won't even be able to notice that there was a global financial crisis. Okay? Now, the other thing is that some things have changed over this period. One of the things that's changed a lot are marginal tax rates. Okay? So that's this. Now I know this looks very messy. That's not good. Okay? But the whole message here is that it's a mess with a message. So what is this? So this is the years, and what's graphed on the vertical axis is the highest marginal tax rate. Okay, so you have the highest marginal tax rate in the US, the UK, Germany, and France. Okay, so you might notice that for a while the highest marginal tax rate in the US, federal income tax, was 0. And then it was really high, and then it came down. Now it's here. Okay? And you'll notice on the growth graph that whenever there are these large changes in marginal taxes, you can see that long-run growth changes remarkably, right? Okay. Now, does that mean taxes have no effect? No, it does not mean taxes that have no effect. But it's not so clear. Changing marginal taxes, high marginal taxes, depends a lot on the particular circumstances, and they're responding to what's going on in the economy more generally. So simply arguing that cut taxes, faster growth, you may get a temporary boom, but in terms of long-run growth, you just can't find evidence for that. Okay. So I also don't think that the taxes are necessarily the best way to reduce inequality in the US. That here what you have is the red line is the top marginal tax rate, and the black line is the proportion of income going to the top 1%. Now, I really don't think that the reduction in the marginal tax rates in the US caused the increase in income inequality in the US. They kind of pointed out that I think technology is primarily at the root of that. It is certainly hard to argue that reducing the top marginal tax rate is going to reduce income inequality. I think that is also fair. Now, there are a variety of, coming back to the more serious point is about corporate taxes and the tax system as a whole. Okay, I would bet that almost all of you know this much better than I, that the tax system is a mess. Okay, and what I don't like, more recently with what Mnuchin talked about, is we're going to simplify the tax code by going from 8 tax categories to 3. I don't think anybody has in mind that the problem with the tax code is that there are too many income categories and we can't figure that out. Okay? So I think that reforming the tax code is very important for fairness and for giving people the right incentives in terms of behavior. I think that the corporate income taxes is too high. It is way uncompetitive in terms of global competition, and it leads to companies spending enormous amounts of time trying to avoid taxes. And we'd rather have all of those smart people spending their time working on something useful. I don't know what, but something useful. Okay? The current proposal is not that type of reform yet. It might become that. Okay? I think many of the people in Congress have a variety of good ideas in order to reform the tax code. But that's not what was currently on the table with the one-page tax reform bill. Okay? So I don't, should there be tax reform? Absolutely. Should the marginal tax rates on corporations be reduced? I think absolutely. Okay, there are many other things that we could think of. So, okay, will infrastructure spending work? Yeah, infrastructure, so for those of you who travel, you go to Shanghai and then you fly back and you're in JFK, it's like, yes, infrastructure spending would be good. No, and you want your bridges to work. All of these things are very valuable. Now, it would have been better to have done the infrastructure spending in 2009. Because we have like a big recession then. Remember? We don't have like a big recession now. But that's okay. Infrastructure spending is not necessarily to deal with the recession. I'm all for the infrastructure spending. This is just, it seems like a worthwhile investment. The other thing about earlier that would have been better is that interest rates were earlier, and they're probably lowest that they're ever going to be in all of our lifetimes. So it's like not a bad time to borrow, fix the infrastructure, and how interest rates are rising, maybe not quite as good, but nonetheless, not a problem. Would it increase demand for labor-intensive type jobs? I think that's yes. I think all of those things are positives. My concern, I have no economic reason for believing this, but is that if tax cuts go first, given the deficits that they're going to cause, will infrastructure spending come? I don't think it's going to increase the probability. Okay, deregulation. So banks have a lot of reserves now. So for those of you who didn't take my class, what I mean by banks have lots of reserves, it means that banks are keeping a lot of money at the Fed. And they have a whole bunch of money at the Fed that they're not lending out. Okay? So deregulation might encourage them to take that money out of the Fed and lend it, and this could cause a boom. Okay? There's no reason to believe that that money is going to be spent on activities that are disproportionately concentrated in labor-intensive jobs. And there's just, why would companies, if companies are going to spend it on what's going to be most profitable, and given what the US is pretty good at, that tends not to be on routine analytical jobs. Now, the concern I have here is that it could trigger a financial crisis. And here I have, this is the thing I would say I'm most concerned about, because it's very easy to get this wrong. So again, for those of you who took my class, maybe this makes you feel good, nostalgic for this. So what is this? Okay, for those of you who haven't taken my class, it's like, what is this? So what you have here in any sort of a company, okay, you have equity holders and you have debt holders and you have executives, and they may have very different incentives for how much risk this entity should undertake. In financial institutions, the largest banks, executives are typically compensated with bonuses or option-type contracts, and those bonuses and option-type contracts have the feature that in order to maximize the value of those types of compensation schemes, you maximize variance. You want to increase risk. An executive oftentimes has very, very little of his or her personal wealth invested in the bank, and yet gets a piece of the upside. So they want to gamble for the upside. Right? Right. Okay. Now, in a typical company, you have the bondholders and other sort of constraining risk. And that's kind of the way companies work, and they kind of, fight about this and whatever. Now, in financial institutions, where you have the government, regulators, or the Fed, the bailing out, the printing of money, oftentimes the investors in the financial institutions, the debt holders and others, they figure that if the thing fails, government's going to bail them out anyway. Right? Last time, everything got bailed out. All of the major banks got bailed out. Okay, Goldman got bailed out essentially, so it was investment banks that got bailed out, there was a big insurance company got bailed out, They came in and they intervened in the commercial paper market, money market mutual funds, which are not insured, were insured. Okay? So if you're an investor, it's only natural that you think that you would be bailed out. And therefore, why are you going to spend so much time fighting with the executives and the equity holders in order to constrain risk? This is the inherent battle. Okay? Now, Dodd-Frank. I am not a fan of Dodd-Frank. I think Dodd-Frank imposes lots of costs, and that leads to banks and executives to make ineffective investments. So I would like to see a reform of financial regulation. However, all of these costs of Dodd-Frank that people point out, I think they're pretty accurate. But Dodd-Frank and all of the other approaches to regulation, they have constrained risk-taking. Okay? So what you want is, you want to get rid of the costs of Dodd-Frank, but at the same time, you need some other type of change that's going to constrain risk-taking. Either directly by constraining it, or even better, by making the decision makers in financial institutions have them have the incentives to constrain risk-taking if you have to take a more market-oriented approach. The only thing I'm sure of, and the reason why I say I'm sure of this is because I've seen it in many countries around the world for as long as I've been a professional economist, is that when you have the executives pulling for more risk, and you have the regulators pulling for less risk, and the regulators let go of the rope, things blow up. And that doesn't mean keep Dodd-Frank, but it does mean that if you're going to get rid of parts of Dodd-Frank, you need to replace it so somebody else or some other set of entities have the incentives to constrain risk-taking. And having participated in this thing at the Treasury last week, I have no confidence that that's going to happen. Okay. Don't worry. It's nice out. I invite all of you over to the Claremont. I'm a member there. We'll all go swimming. Everybody will be happier. Okay, it's warm out there. Okay. So I told my wife, I'm going to make all these people unhappy, and it's like, it's the same thing, you invite an economist, it's like, the world is going to end. It's like, oh man, okay. So what's going to happen? I think that there'll be I think that there's likely to be a temporary boom. I think that the tax cuts will generate a temporary boom. I think that financial deregulation will create a temporary boom. I think it'll be tempered. I think the debt is going to temper things. And the Fed, I think the Fed is going to justifiably look at this situation and say, you know what? With these policies, we're at full employment. Okay? And none of these policies are increasing potential output. They're sort of all short term. So the Fed is going to look at this and say, well, we're at full employment. What are we supposed to do? Well, what we're supposed to do is increase interest rates. And I think that that's what we're going to do. So I think you're going to see rising interest rates that will temper some of the effects of the deregulation and the tax cuts. I don't see anything here having an enduring effect on the middle class or income inequality. I think that the infrastructure spending will help some, but that's a one-off thing. It's not something that changes things in the long run. And maybe this is like, I was thinking, maybe this is totally self-serving as well, but if you're going to look at what is at the root of the cause is that the US and many other countries haven't increased their production of analytical skills, education, universities, etc. Rich will be proud. Okay, no, but in all seriousness, in terms of a situation that has evolved over several decades, it's not going to be solved by, I really don't think it's going to be solved by a tax cut. Tax reform, very beneficial. Infrastructure spending, very beneficial. But in terms of something that's evolved over such a long period of time and may endure because of increased technological advances, I don't know how you address this without improving education. Okay, risks. I don't think there's going to be a trade war. It is a risk, but I really don't think that's going to happen. I think that some bilateral deals are going to be negotiated. I think that's going to save some establishments here and there. I think that's going to respond to a variety of constituencies. I don't see it having too big a negative effect, and probably has some positive effect. I don't see a broad change. I think that to the extent that this closing off reduces the inflow of really talented people, this is costly. Okay, there's some recent evidence which shows that the US, since this whole talk has really been focused so much on the US, that the US has benefited enormously from the inflow of really high-skilled, innovative workers. There's no reason why Silicon Valley has to be in Silicon Valley if it becomes an unpleasant place for the most talented people to congregate. Okay, I don't think that's going to change. Okay, I don't think that I just don't think that, I don't see the forces for that taking place. The US dollar, I think, was likely to appreciate. Interest rates are likely to rise. This could cause really adverse effects in many countries around the world. And for companies that have their debts denominated in dollars, maybe not so good. For countries that have their debts denominated in dollars, also not so good. The financial crisis and deregulation, you could kind of bummed about that one. So. Yeah, no, it's an odd thing that several of the policies that are being embraced could intensify the trade deficit in the short run if the dollar gets stronger by imported brie. So. Many people have dropped out of the workplace. And from what I understand is these are people who are unlikely to come back into the workplace. The regions that you described, the people who dropped out of the workplace with the crisis in 2008 and the enduring recession afterwards, a lot of the people who are in the 50s, they dropped out of the workplace and they're not coming back. So I think from the Fed's perspective, when they're looking at aggregate statistics, when they looked after the recession, or after the financial crisis, there was a period where the reason why unemployment went down was because so many people dropped out of the workplace. I think their assessments now, and I don't see any reason to dispute them, are that many of the people that were going to come back have come back, and a lot of the people that haven't come back are unlikely to come back, period. So I think that their assessment going forward is going to be that they're more likely to continue raising rates to normal levels. They would call normalization of rates. I could be wrong about that for sure, many things, but they've been quite clear about where they think things are going and their view that the economy is at something close to full employment. So, on the one hand, I wouldn't bother me at all. On the other hand, to me, it's unfortunate that we're in this situation because there are a lot of big problems that need to be addressed. Unfortunate that things have become so extremely polarized that people with different views can't discuss. I mean, all the same things that you hear every day in the press. But there are real problems. Middle-class wages have stagnated since the 70s. Income inequality has grown. It's not surprising that people get very angry and disillusioned. And you would want some sort of a response. What I'm suggesting, perhaps a lot of that response would come in the form of of an energetic response to human capital development, education. I think infrastructure is something that really could be done in much more effectively. I think that tax reform would be a wonderful undertaking that doesn't have to be partisan. You could clean up the tax code, make it revenue neutral, and then make a variety of decisions about whether you want to increase spending, reduce spending, where you're going to have more natural partisan disagreements. So doing nothing while things continue to fester runs the risk that I always worried about when I looked at the graph from the beginning, where you have average going up and you have the median staying constant, and it means you're going to get people angry, frustrated, and confused and pulled towards extremes. Either towards one extreme of massive redistribution or another extreme where quote, other people are made to be villains. And as that situation festers, the appeal of the extreme grows. And so I agree with you, and that might be the best outcome given the current situation, but yeah. It's not, sorry.
My question is exactly a follow-up on that, which is that other than enhancing labor force skills, do you have any other suggestions for reducing income inequality? I mean, common things that are raised are things like increasing the minimum wage, strengthening labor unions, reducing illegal immigration, or other kinds of suggestions?
So, I tend to take a very long run view of things. And that's why I kind of keep coming back to education, because I see sort of a problem, and I see that as one way of addressing it. When I look at the tax code, I don't really think it makes sense to use it to try to stimulate output. I want to make it more efficient so that resources flow to where they're best used. I have many of my friends work in accounting firms or in investment banks, and extremely brilliant people who spend all of their time trying to save money on taxes for whoever they're working for. And something seems unfortunate about having all of that creativity go towards something that's privately useful to those companies, but maybe not in terms of the long run. Illegal immigration, yes, here you get to very difficult decisions about people, but to the extent that you view a country as a club, it's going to have to decide who its members are. And it's going to come up with rules and regulations about that, and it's going to have to choose to enforce those. But I don't think that that's what accounts for hardly any of what we see from the mid-'70s to now. Sorry, I have to wrap up. I wrapped up. Thank you.